Jim Chapman, welcome to the Bookshelf Conversation.
Ron, so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is a very impressive, massive, and I can say now award-winning book, uh, Baseball Photography of the Deadball Era, rediscovering the early lensmen and their indelible images that brought the game from the field to the fans, which has just been made the recipient of the Ritter Award, Saber's highest honor for books primarily about the deadball area. So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
This is a massive undertaking, and why did you decide you wanted to do this?
Well, over the course of the last 10 years or so, I've really gotten into collecting Deadball era original photographs that were printed at that time. And as I kind of got deeper into the collecting, I realized A, there wasn't a lot of knowledge base about them out there. And then B, as I started digging in, that a lot of the story of deadball baseball and the rise of press photography, not just in baseball, but in the industry, the photographic aspect really came into being in the 2 decades of the deadball era. So I found that fascinating, and there's an untold story just waiting to be told.
How difficult was it to do the research for something that's basically 100 years old?
It not it, it was difficult, yes. With a couple of factors. Obviously, this book could not have been written 30 years ago without the internet, because most of it was conducted over research over the internet, and also from fellow collectors who had information that they had of piecemeal in the market that I was able to kind of consolidate and build on. But also, a lot of these photographs were original news photographs, and they were deep in the archives of a lot of the newspapers. And once they started to digitize from about the 1990s on, that these photographs kind of came into the hobby and into the public market. And that's really with all the markings on the back of them and such, where you can really kind of uncover the clues that tell the story.
Well, one of the things, this particular blog is niche in that it basically only deals with baseball books. A few other things too. If it goes on a bookshelf, it can go on this blog. So that's pretty niche. Then you have the niche era section of baseball photographs in general. This is even more niche. How did you go about spreading the word? How did collectors find you and were able to share their information with you?
Well, the interestingly enough, about 20 years ago, Henry Yee, who is the lead authenticator for PSA photographic authentication, about 20 years ago, with a couple of collaborators, wrote just a general book about baseball photography, covering all the eras, up until the then current era, and it had some background information in there, and so that most collectors have that book and are aware of it. And I know Henry Yee, who had written that, and I had contacted him and said, Henry, are you ever going to do a follow up edition to this? And he basically said, Jim, I'm not going to be able to get to it anytime soon. And so I decided to do a follow up and focus on the dead ball era. And I started out just looking at the stampings and trying to identify the photos. But the deeper that I dug, the more I realized that there was a story to be told. And accessing, after 10 years of collecting the photos, I had a lot of contacts within the hobby of the people. As you said, it's a very niche, a very small set of dedicated collectors. So I kind of knew who I could talk to, who I needed to talk to. And fortunately, they were all very willing to share their knowledge and information. And they served as an invaluable source of vetting. If I had a theory or found facts that, I could bounce that off of them and see if they had anything that would, recalibrate it slightly, or say, yes, we think you're on the right track on that.
This seems like an expensive hobby.
It can be very expensive, although it depends on who you collect. I mean, if you want to buy an original photograph of Ty Cobb that was used for the Cracker Jack card, you're probably talking 500,000 at auction.
Holy cow.
If you wanted just a general generic dead ball era player from, say, the 1910s, you may be spending 50 or 100, for a photograph. So there are different points of entry, but yes, it can become expensive if you desire to collect the more famous Hall of Famers.
About 30 years ago, Neil and Constance McCabe published a book of George Conlin's photos. I've always been fascinated with his work. I've found I'm amazed when I look at the pictures of the players, how old they seem. These are young men in their 20s, yet for some reason they seem much older. Is that something you've noticed in your travels?
I have noticed, and ironically, Neil McCabe reached out to me, about the book, and was thrilled to see it, and it was a great. He told me great stories about his work with Larry Ritter on doing the audio version of the book. Um, and,
I'm sorry, an audio version of a book on photography?
well, on actually, well, no, Neil put out his book on Conlon, but he also helped Larry Ritter with The Glory of Their Times
Oh,
back
okay.
in the 90s when they
Right.
released that on. He helped produce that. So
Gotcha.
he was very familiar with Larry, and it was a thrill to me when he says Larry would have just loved your book.
The the there's one chapter in particular, and it deals a little with Conlon. Uh, Forgive me a second while I dig it out. The title of the chapter is "Why Photographs Take Us" by Paul Reiferson, and I hope I'm pronouncing that
Paul
right.
Reverson, yes.
Reiferson. Why do the photos take us, and how do the photos take us?
As I put in my introduction to the book, to me, baseball cards, which most of us collected as younger men and some of us still into adulthood, those are a beautiful daydream. And that, the pastel colors, and you can all envision yourself on the big league mound one day, being a pitcher. Whereas I view the photographs as a time machine that, for example, I use an example in the book of the Walter Johnson kind of rearing back to be able to throw in his windup. And on the Cracker Jack card, that's just against a solid red background with his, profile cutout picture. If you look at the actual photograph taken by Francis Burke, um, circa 1912 on that, you can clearly identify this was at Chicago, at the stadium. And, you can see the uniform, you can see the dirt, you can see the people in the background. And it's kind of a, you are there in a way that those photographs bring that era back to life to us. And as you mentioned earlier about just seeing how old the players seemed, that some of these photographers were developed relationships, particularly the New York photographers, because with three teams in the major leagues covering both the American and national, almost all the players cycled through there. So at a photographer base there, we get to know the players and develop a relationship and to get those expressions. And it's almost like in the military, you've heard of the 1,000-mile or 1,000-yard stare. That kind of, he kind of achieves that same effect because the cameras in those days, they had the view lens. If you've ever seen some of the old cameras of the pictures of the photographer, they're looking down in the viewer and they're holding the camera with the lens more like waist high. So on a lot of the players, they would actually have the players step down into the dugout steps as the photographer stood field level so they could get the straight on, eye contact, version, kind of a more of a heroic angle. And so because you're seeing them not posed in the studio but on the field, you kind of catch that grittiness, of the game and how kind of baseball was a dirty job, back in that day and time.
I'm glad you brought that up. I want to talk a little bit about. We mentioned that it's expensive to research. It's expensive to collect. How expensive was it to produce photos in those days? Now everything is digital. It doesn't cost anything to rattle off 100 pictures at a time. But in those days, I imagine between the cameras, the processing must have been fairly expensive.
It was relatively expensive, but you have to remember they were making rapid innovations. If you look at a newspaper from the 1890s, and let's say you had Willie Keeler for Baltimore, if you saw him in the newspaper, he was probably wearing a tuxedo and there was a wood cut print appearing in the newspaper of him. But by the early 1900s, with the gelatin silver glass plate negatives and the cameras that you could actually take out onto the field, that technology was evolving pretty rapidly. In fact, many of the photographers would build their own cameras in that day and age. And
The
so that it was expensive, but then, if you look at George Grantham Bain, who wasn't a photographer himself, but had one of the earliest and first news services, Bain News Service. They would produce standard, 4x5 glass negatives, and they had an auto printer that would allow them to take those negatives and just do contact prints and print them off. I think I even show in the book, an example of that machine that they invented to rapidly reproduce so that they could, send out 50 copies of a photo to newspapers around the country.
So,
So
so
they quickly got economies of scale. I mean, and that's why you don't see many photos in the early 1900s. But once the technology ramped up, by the 1920s, you're pretty much entering the pure modern era of reproducing photographs.
so you mentioned these services. Talk about the process of you have the photographer on the field who takes the pictures. What happens next?
Well, I mean, and a lot of those photographers, I would probably say the vast majority of them, are still anonymous to us this day, till this day. That Paul Thompson was a famous, what people thought was a photographer. He was really a owner of the article syndicate. He was an agent, for photographers. The photographer would get them, and he would take them back to either one of these, photo aggregator news services, or if he worked directly for a newspaper, he would take it back to the office, and then they had a team that would have dark rooms and produce the photographs. So, for example, Conlon is the most famous photographer from that era, and perhaps the most famous of any era. And some of his photographs, he had a dark room at his home, and on some of them, you can see a stamp of an address that was actually, I was able to establish as his home address. And there's a high likelihood that he would have printed some of those, and they are known for their clarity and tone and being contact prints that he produced. Versus the Evening Telegram, which he worked for, as he became much more of a mass producer, he would take it and hand the negatives over to the staff, and you would have not necessarily photographers, but people working in the darkroom that would produce the photograph and use it for the newspaper. And some of those prints are not quite as high quality because, quite frankly, they weren't, he wasn't printing the photos to give to you or me as a fan. They were just reproducing them in, halftone print to be put in the newspaper. So it didn't have to be a superb high quality to be reproduced, over and over.
So you mentioned the photography pre 1900. A lot of that was studio work, where they would
Most
up, set up.
Most of it was. I mean, there were a few photographers. You do see some 1890s photographs, on the field, but those are few and far between. Much more within the baseball hobby and the card hobby. Carl Horner is famous because a lot of his images were used for those earliest card sets from the very first part of the 20th century. But he was almost exclusively a studio photographer, that he would have the player come in and pose against the background. In fact, he was almost the glamour shots of the day because, like Red Duin, had freckles all over his face. And I've actually seen the glass plate negative that he used for that photo, and he has taken a pencil and marked out every one of those freckles. He has whitewashed it so he has a clean complexion. It's a photo you would give to mom, rather than a photo that that you're going to use for baseball. So that it was very much a different scene, in the early 1900s versus once those photographers, like Conlon was on the field. He started in 1904, and that really kind of kick-started photographers on the field for games.
How difficult was it in the very early days to do action photography?
It was incredibly difficult. They just didn't have the camera speed to capture it. In fact, one of the photographers profiled in the book, John C. Hemmett, was actually, his specialty was actually horse racing, and he is the father of the photo finish. He developed his own camera with dual lenses, dual plates, so that he could take, he called it instantaneous photography, but that he could take a series of photos and then develop them. And on the horse races, you could see that the horse won by a nose. And translating to the baseball field, and you'll even see in the book, there's a series of several images. One famous one of Mathewson in circa 1903, where he took 4 or 5 sequence of shots, showing him from the windup through the delivery. And if you lay them out, it's almost like a flip book that you can kind of see him in action, just following the progression of the photo. So he was an innovator in doing the action photography. And then by 1910, that was a fairly common. If you think of probably the most famous shot is Conlon's shot of Cobb sliding into third base, which is
Mhm.
circa 1910. And that by that time they had mastered that art pretty well.
One of the things that always fascinates me is you can go back to pre-1960s and find pictures of the photographers on the field taking the pictures.
Right. And then
Let's
there
look.
are. I mean, there's even I've seen photos, and I think there is on the book of the 1912 World Series where the photographers are actually perched on the roof of Fenway Park.
So you
And
have
just
all,
places that obviously they would never allow them today, but it's fascinating to see back in the day of just where they were allowed access.
so let's talk about the practicalities of bringing this book to the public. This
Mhm.
is a self-published book, correct?
It is.
Did you try to have it published by a traditional company?
Ron, I didn't even reach out to a single publisher. And I'll tell you why. I knew because this is an extremely niche book. I mean, it will appeal. If a baseball fan looks at it, they all love it when they do. But if you try to go to a publisher and say, I would like to write a 5 pound hardbound glossy photo paper dust jacket book, and I'd like to price it at about $75. And can you produce this? And oh, by the way, will you give me complete editorial control? I've never written a book in my life. Um, and I can't guarantee you there's a market, but this is a project I'd like to do. I realized how preposterous that would be going to any publisher and having any real expectation of them doing it. So I decided early on this was a passion project. I wanted to do it sink or swim. I wanted to do it on my own terms, and to the quality level and the detail level that I wanted, without outside interference, quite frankly. I wanted complete control, over the process. So the biggest challenge, honestly, was finding, and I actually ended up finding an excellent print broker that the book, if you'll notice, is printed in South Korea. Domestically, it would have cost many multiples time. It would have been not feasible to do the book, printing it domestically under traditional publishing.
So obviously, it is a very handsome product. You should be very proud of the work you produced. You talk about having complete control. Did you find what was the most difficult part of putting this together?
It was really doing the research and making sure that I was comfortable that I was telling the complete story as much as I could. But I would say at least half the content of that book I uncovered during the process of writing it. It wasn't like I gathered all the information and then started to write the book. I started to write the book, and I would encounter a new thread and would go down that and discover even more. And so that was probably gathering and condensing the knowledge was probably the greatest challenge because,
How
like I
long
say, a lot of this is uncharted waters.
and how long did this take you from start to finish?
About a year.
Wow, that's pretty good for
I'm
something like this with all that research and all the
I'm a fast worker. I'm a fast worker, and I say I did that in my spare time, just kind of pulling it all together. I think the key is knowing the questions to ask and where to look.
Did you have I know you said this was your control. Did you have any outside help taking a look at this and saying, this works in the publishing world, this doesn't?
I did not,
Hmm.
you know, totally did it on my own. My wife assisted in editing, in part. She was a big help, on that. And my collaborators, I would periodically send them out, samples of where it was to have them vetted, and they were invaluable to be able to, you know, I didn't print it unless there was a general consensus that that was actually, what it was or likely to be. So
Did you
that kind of
enjoy the
helped.
experience, or was it a get a little burdensome after a while?
No, no, I loved it. I mean, I didn't do this to make a profit or as a job. It was a labor of love. So
Labor of love.
if it had become work, I would have abandoned the project. I was truly enjoying the whole process.
So having had this experience, do you have plans for another book?
I would consider it at some point in the future. I'm still having fun with this project, and who knows? There may someday be a second edition. although that would be some time off in the future if I did. But I would have to, many writers get a formula and they, repeat that formula over and over. I'm really not interested in that. If I found another passion project and if I thought there was a story to be told that had not been told that I would. As of right now, that has not, I'm not actively looking and it hasn't presented as such. But I
Well,
enjoyed the writing experience. So I would totally be open to, in the future, doing another project.
well, in addition to winning the Ritter Award, I think you should be getting some sort of Rookie of the Year award for a first book. We've been talking with Jim Chapman, author of Baseball Photography of the Deadball Era. Jim, you're on your way to the Sabre Convention where you will receive the award. Is that correct?
That is correct. I will be there this Saturday and receiving the award and just giving a brief book talk. So if anyone is in the area and desires to go, I will be there this Saturday.
Do you have a presence on the web where people can find out more?
Yes, if they go to my website, Chapman Deadball Collection, spelled just like it sounds.com, they can see more about the book, and a lot of my images that I've collected over the years are on there that you can go and take a look at those images and see some of the stories. Now, like I say, and the book is available there if they're so inclined.
All right, Jim, thank you very much for talking with us today. Enjoy your Sabre experience.
No, thank you.